A man in a plain white shirt, no badge, no guards, blocked at a steel gate. But just 17 minutes later, an entire nation began to cry. That man was President Ibrahim Traoré. Why was a soldier who once risked his life for justice turned away by his own people? And what happened next that made a security guard break down in front of the cameras? Not out of fear, but because something deep inside him was awakened. This isn't just a story about power. It's a story about courage, forgiveness, and a leader who walked straight into the storm to do what was right. It was the kind of day that felt too big for silence. The sun blazed high over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows over freshly swept streets. The smell of roasted peanuts, grilled corn, and sun-warmed red earth filled the air. Vendors lined the sidewalks, their stalls wrapped in flags of Burkina Faso, their radios blasting upbeat music that couldn't quite hide the thrum of anticipation pulsing through the city. This wasn't just another Tuesday. It was the Day of Honor, a national celebration, official, televised, and emotional, meant to recognize the man many called their people's president, Ibrahim Traoré. From all corners of the country they came, children wearing shirts that read, "Our hero Traoré," women balancing baskets of gifts, veterans standing in full uniform despite the heat, school kids holding handmade signs. Inside the Grand National Civic Arena, a special golden seat awaited the president, hand-carved by artisans, polished with oil, and stitched with gold thread. It sat under a spotlight, glowing like a throne carved from the hopes of the poor. But outside, something unusual was unfolding. At the VIP gate, where armored SUVs usually roared through and dignitaries in dark suits were ushered in with applause, a vehicle pulled up so quietly that no one noticed at first. It was a black Toyota, unmarked, unescorted, completely silent. No flags, no sirens, no tinted convoy cars. The door opened slowly and out stepped a man. His clothes were ordinary. A plain white shirt, half crumpled, marked with red dust, simple trousers, sandals, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if worn more from memory than age. He approached the security checkpoint alone. The young guard at the post stood firm. He was new. This was his first major assignment: protect the gate, enforce the list. VIPs only. His orders were clear. "Sir, no badge, no entry." He said it loud enough to be confident, but not so loud as to sound disrespectful. The man didn't flinch. He smiled politely and replied quietly, "I am Ibrahim Traoré." For a beat, there was silence. The guard blinked. He frowned. He looked again at the dusty man in front of him, as if searching for a joke. He chuckled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sorry, sir. The president doesn't come like this." A few heads nearby turned. A child tugged at his father's sleeve. Someone raised their phone. "Record. Something's happening." The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash a badge or call for backup. He simply stood there. The tension was strange, quiet, but tight, like the air right before a thunderstorm. And then the whispers began. "Wait, is that really him? No, it can't be. Look at his clothes. But he looks just like... Where's his security?" The phones came up like a wave. TikTok, Instagram, Facebook Live, all watching what looked like a mix-up, but felt like something more. The security guard now looked uncomfortable. Sweat formed at his temple. He glanced at his supervisor's booth, then back at the man, still standing, still calm. Somewhere inside the arena, the announcer was already preparing to welcome the president to thunderous applause. But the president was still outside, waiting at the gate, being told he wasn't on the list. Was this carelessness? A security lapse? Or was this something else? A test? A message? A moment? The man's silence became its own kind of speech, and as the world kept watching, one unspoken question echoed louder than any drumbeat. What kind of leader waits when he has the power to force his way through? The story hadn't even started, but already history had arrived at the gate. There was a moment, just a breath, where everyone expected him to push back, to call someone, to flash a presidential ID, raise his voice, demand respect. After all, he was the head of state, and he had just been denied entry to his own national celebration. But Ibrahim Traoré did none of that. He simply nodded once, eyes calm, almost understanding. Then with a soft, "Thank you," he turned around. No drama, no resistance, just quiet. The security guard, still confused, watched him walk away, unhurried, unbothered, like a man heading towards something even he couldn't fully explain. The crowd near the gate parted, unsure whether to follow, record, or just stare. Phones stayed up, faces leaned forward. What now? Traoré didn't head for the back entrance or call for his team. Instead, he began walking, on foot, around the side of the massive civic arena, on a dusty footpath worn down by years of street vendors and children playing ball. His sandals brushed over gravel and cigarette butts. The sun beat down harshly, but he didn't flinch. His steps were steady, like he had walked these streets 1,000 times. And maybe he had. He passed a woman selling cold drinks under a faded umbrella. She did a double take, then whispered to her neighbor, "That looks like him." A man fixing his bicycle looked up and froze. Children stopped chasing each other, slowly turning their heads as if sensing something important was happening. Some people began to follow, but from a distance. No one approached. No one dared ask if it was really him. There was a strange reverence in the air, like watching a lion walk through a marketplace. Powerful but silent, present but untouchable. Traoré kept walking. He moved past food vendors, weavers, old men playing dominoes under the shade. One of them stood, raised his hand in a salute instinctively, then dropped it as if unsure. Was this really happening? A boy, barefoot, maybe 8 years old, ran up with a piece of roasted corn. He looked up at the man in the white shirt, dusty and sweat-soaked, and asked with honest curiosity, "Why are you out here, sir?" Traoré paused. He bent down slightly to meet the boy's eyes. "Because today," he said gently, "is not about me. It's about all of us." The boy blinked, unsure what to say, then handed him the corn. "You can have this." Traoré smiled. "Thank you, little brother. That means more than you know." Behind them, murmurs were growing louder. The small cluster of people had turned into a slow-moving ripple. Market vendors, shoppers, teens with phones, elders with canes, watching the most powerful man in the country walk like one of them. Not above them, among them. A journalist sitting at a corner cafe waiting for the official motorcade spotted the movement. He squinted, then grabbed his camera and began snapping furiously. This wasn't on the press schedule. Further ahead, Traoré saw the outer curve of the arena, the crowd sounds from inside barely audible over the ambient city noise. Still, he didn't change pace. His aides had caught on and were rushing toward him from the opposite end, waving, trying to intervene. He stopped them with a single gesture, a raised hand, calm but firm. "No," he said softly, "let them see me like this." And so he walked on. No guards, no motorcade, no official badge. Just dust on his shoulders, sandals on his feet, and a message unspoken, but louder than any anthem. The people followed. Some whispered, some cried, some didn't know what to feel. But they all kept walking, and in that moment, power didn't look like a convoy or a title. Power looked like a man, choosing to walk through his people instead of ahead of them. By the time Ibrahim Traoré reached the end of the long curve around the stadium, a line had already formed at the public entrance. Farmers in worn shirts, women carrying toddlers, students with notebooks tucked under their arms. No one looked twice when he joined the queue. To them, he was just another man attending the ceremony, just another citizen. There were no spotlights waiting for him here, no red carpet, no officials ready to bow. Just a low gate, a metal detector, and a handful of tired guards waving people through. He waited like everyone else. Some shuffled forward, some fanned themselves in the heat. One man wiped his brow, turned to Traoré, and asked casually, "You here for the event?" "Yes," Traoré said with a small smile. "I'm hoping to learn something." The man chuckled. "They say the president's a good man. Maybe we'll see him today." Traoré nodded once but said nothing more. Inside the arena, the official program was already in motion. A master of ceremonies stood on the stage, reading from a gilded script. Music played. Drummers beat in synchronized rhythm. The crowd, thousands strong, filled every corner of the stadium. A golden chair at the front of the stage sat empty under a glowing spotlight, carved and polished by local artists for weeks. It was meant for the guest of honor. "Where is he?" someone whispered in the audience. "Why hasn't he arrived?" A few organizers fidgeted nervously behind the curtains. The motorcade hadn't shown up. The presidential seat remained untouched. Whispers spread like wind. And then, without announcement, without music, without warning, he entered. Not through the VIP tunnel, not escorted by guards, not with any fanfare. He walked in through the main public entrance, just like everyone else, alone. It took a moment for anyone to truly notice. His shirt was dusty, his sleeves rolled, no badge, no sash, no aides. Just a man stepping into a place built to celebrate him, like he didn't expect to be celebrated at all. First, a few heads turned, then more. Murmurs. Someone dropped a bottle. A child stopped mid-bite into a piece of flatbread. One by one, people began to rise. Not with applause, not with cheering, but with stillness. Complete, reverent stillness. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the air itself had thickened with meaning. An old man near the front row stood with difficulty, gripping a walking stick. He looked long and hard at the figure approaching the stage. And then, in a voice raw and shaking, he said it loud enough for all to hear. "He walks with us, because he is one of us." And just like that, something unspoken passed through the crowd. It wasn't planned, it wasn't instructed, but it happened all the same. They stood, not to cheer, but to witness. They stared, not in shock, but in shared understanding. Because at that moment, the line between leader and people disappeared. The golden chair at the front still gleamed under the spotlight. But the real spotlight was now on the dust on his shirt, the quiet in his steps, the way his presence calmed the chaos instead of commanding it. He didn't wave. He didn't smile broadly. He simply walked toward the crowd. Not ahead of them, not above them, but with them. And as he passed, a kind of silence fell over the arena. But it wasn't awkward. It wasn't empty. It was sacred. The kind of silence you feel when history walks by, wearing sandals. At the front of the stage, under a brilliant white spotlight, sat a chair unlike any other in the entire arena. It wasn't just furniture, it was a statement. Hand-carved from rare West African hardwood, its back was etched with traditional symbols of protection, unity, and strength. The armrest gleamed with inlays of brass, and the seat cushion was embroidered with gold thread. Local artisans had worked for weeks, sometimes through the night, to make it worthy of one man. This was the chair reserved for President Ibrahim Traoré, and it was still empty. The spotlight, as if unaware of the delay, remained fixed on the throne, making it appear almost ghostly, brilliant but untouched. Around it, rows of dignitaries had taken their seats. Military officers, cabinet members, elders, even visiting journalists, all facing forward, occasionally glancing at their watches or muttering quietly to one another. The program was already 20 minutes behind schedule, and the man they had gathered to honor was nowhere to be seen. Backstage, the master of ceremonies, an experienced speaker used to handling crowds and crises, was beginning to panic. He had just whispered to an aide, "Where is he?" This isn't like him. The aide could only shrug. The official convoy had never arrived. The presidential team was unreachable, and no one had seen Traoré step through any known gate. But the cameras were rolling. The audience was waiting. The script had to move forward. He stepped onto the stage, adjusted his mic, and began his announcement. His voice was steady, but anyone watching closely could see the unease behind his polished expression. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we gather to honor a man whose leadership has restored dignity, security, and hope to our nation. Please welcome the President of the Transition, Captain Ibrahim Traoré." He paused. No response. No footsteps. No procession. Nothing. The crowd hesitated. A few polite claps. Confused glances. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat, then improvised. Perhaps the President is greeting citizens outside. I'm sure he'll join us shortly." Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré was seated at the far edge of the crowd, quietly watching from the stands. He wasn't in the VIP section. He wasn't on the program's schedule. He hadn't entered with his name announced or with any security escort. He had walked in like everyone else, through the side entrance, after standing in line, just a face among thousands. And now sitting on a plain wooden bench, shoulder to shoulder with a grandmother and two young students, he held a single, small, worn photograph in his hands. He looked down at it, brushing the corner with his thumb. The photo wasn't much, faded, slightly torn. In it stood a little boy, barefoot, in front of a crumbling mud house. His clothes were torn. His face held the kind of stare children learn too early, one shaped more by hunger and dust than by innocence. That boy was him. He didn't need to be reminded of where he came from. But holding that photo grounded him, like a stone tucked into a pocket to remember who you were before people called you sir. Up on the stage, the spotlight remained trained on the golden chair. Empty, shining, waiting. Someone backstage asked whether they should seat a representative in his place, perhaps a minister, a general. The idea was quickly dismissed. That chair was more than decoration. It had become sacred. To sit in it without earning it, without being the one it was built for, felt almost offensive. No one dared, because deep down, every person in that arena, whether they knew where Traoré was or not, understood one thing. That chair was not meant for power. It was meant for presence. And today, the presence was not on stage. It was among the people. The air inside the arena held a strange tension, not impatience, not restlessness, but a growing sense that something unusual was unfolding, the kind of moment that wasn't planned in a script or controlled by protocol. It was the kind of moment where silence grows louder than applause, and the most important seat in the room remained waiting, but not because its owner was absent, because he had chosen, once again, to sit somewhere else. The golden chair still sat empty, glowing under the spotlight like a monument to a man who had, by all measures, already arrived. But all eyes began shifting, not toward the front of the stage, but toward a quiet movement at the edge of the arena. A figure was rising from one of the public benches. It took a second, maybe two, for people to realize who he was. And by the time he stepped forward, the silence inside the stadium had transformed into something thick and sacred, like the breath before a prayer. Ibrahim Traoré walked toward the stage. No security guards flanking him, no advisors shuffling papers, no teleprompter, no script, just him, and a single photograph folded gently in his hand. When he reached the stairs, he paused for a moment, not because he hesitated, but because he seemed to be absorbing the moment, carrying its weight with him. The master of ceremonies stepped aside instantly. The mic was his now. He took the stage like a man stepping into his own living room, unhurried, without pretense. He didn't scan the crowd for cameras. He didn't raise his hands for applause. He simply unfolded the photo in his palm and held it up. It was small, old, faded. Some in the front rows squinted. Others leaned forward. And then, when the large screen behind the stage projected the image for all to see, a soft murmur moved like a breeze across the crowd. In the picture, a little boy, barefoot, standing in front of a cracked mud house. His shirt was oversized and torn at the collar. His knees were dusty, his eyes hollow but burning with something deeper. Maybe hunger, maybe hope, maybe both. Traoré looked at the photo for a long moment before speaking. "This," he began, his voice low but clear, "was me." Gasps echoed across the stadium. "I was not born in a palace," he continued. "There were no golden chairs in my childhood, no cameras, no bodyguards. I ate once a day, sometimes not at all." He paused. "On the day this picture was taken, I had eaten a piece of dry millet. I drank water from a cracked plastic bottle I found on the roadside. It was the only thing I had." He looked out at the thousands of faces staring back at him. Some were tearful, some were stunned, all were silent. "And yet," he went on, "I never felt alone, because someone believed in me, a teacher, a neighbor, my mother. Burkina Faso believed in me, before I believed in myself." The microphone caught the tremble in his voice, not because he was nervous, but because he meant every word. He held the photo up once more. "This boy," he said, "is not gone. He walks with me every day. When I make decisions, when I meet world leaders, when I sit at negotiation tables, he is always there, reminding me that no matter how far I go, I come from the dust." He folded the photo slowly and tucked it back into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "No title will ever separate me from where I came from," he said, voice steady now, stronger. "Not general, not president, not captain, because I know what it means to have nothing and still dream." He looked at the golden chair one last time, but he didn't move toward it. He turned his gaze back to the people, men and women, soldiers and farmers, students and elders, and he nodded once. "I'm not here to be honored," he said quietly. "I'm here to remember." The crowd still said nothing, but the silence was deafening, a silence that said, "We see you, we believe you, we remember with you." And somewhere in the stands, a grandmother wiped her eyes and whispered to the child beside her, "He still walks barefoot, even if the world tries to crown him." As the last words of his speech lingered in the hushed air, Ibrahim Traoré stepped down from the stage, not toward the media, not toward the exit, and certainly not toward the golden chair that still sat under the spotlight, gleaming like a trophy waiting for its winner. Instead, he walked slowly toward it. The entire arena followed his every move. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, not because of exhaustion, but because of the weight of what the chair had come to represent. Power, celebration, status. He paused right in front of it. The ornate carvings glistened under the lights. The embroidery shimmered. It looked regal, majestic, like it belonged to someone whose hands had never touched mud, whose clothes had never known dust. Traoré looked at the chair for a long moment. Somewhere backstage, a camera operator zoomed in, expecting the moment he would finally sit, when honor would be complete. Ushers waited. Ministers leaned forward. The crowd held its breath. And then he shook his head. Once, gently, but unmistakably. Without a word, he turned away. Gasps rippled through the arena, not loud but enough to be felt. Enough to say, "Wait, what is he doing?" Then they saw where he was headed, just a few meters behind the main stage. Tucked against a side wall where no cameras were pointed, stood a row of simple wooden benches, the kind used by cleaning crews, stage hands and volunteers. No cushion, no carvings, no spotlight. He walked to the very last bench and sat down, quietly, peacefully, naturally, as if that had been his seat all along. The arena was frozen. No one clapped. No one cheered. But the silence returned, not empty, but reverent, like the pause after a great truth has been spoken without words. Somewhere in the front row, a little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why doesn't he sit there?" she whispered, pointing to the golden chair. The mother, eyes glistening, bent down and replied softly, "Because his heart is bigger than that chair." The child didn't speak again. She just watched. So did the rest of the nation. The cameras slowly panned away from the empty throne, now seemingly too small for the moment it was meant to hold. They focused instead on the quiet man in a dusty shirt, sitting among people who were never supposed to be seen. One by one, the audience began to understand. This wasn't a rejection of honor. It was a redefinition of it. Traoré nodded to the janitor beside him, greeted a volunteer folding programs, rested his hands on his knees and took a deep breath, one that said, "I belong here, with you." The golden chair remained empty, but for the first time no one felt like it had been left behind. Because where he chose to sit, that was the real seat of power, and it didn't need gold to shine. He hadn't moved from the gate. The young security guard stood exactly where he'd been earlier that afternoon, right where he had lifted his hand to stop a man in a white shirt and dusty sandals from entering. He had thought he was doing his job. He had thought the man was just another local trying to sneak in without credentials. No badge, no clearance. That was the rule. But then someone whispered it to him. The whisper traveled like smoke, thin, invisible, but inescapable. That was the president. The words struck him like thunder. His eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, almost unwillingly, to glance back at the entrance where the man had stood so calmly, so silently, and had walked away. The realization hit him in waves, that dusty shirt, that calm voice, that steady eye contact. He hadn't believed it. He hadn't even looked closely enough to consider. His stomach sank. He pulled the clipboard closer to his chest like it could shield him from the weight of what had just happened. He quickly scanned the name list again, his fingers trembling. The print swam before his eyes. There was no photo, no warning, just a name. President Ibrahim Traoré. He had said it himself. I am Ibrahim Traoré. And the guard had laughed. Now his ears burned. His hands went cold. His knees felt weak. Behind him someone chuckled, not kindly but mockingly. Another voice joined in. Hey, hero! You just turned away the president. Phones were already recording. Lenses were pointed at his face. He could feel the heat of the attention crawling up his neck like fire. One woman muttered, What kind of guard doesn't recognize his own president? A teenager snorted, This is gonna go viral. Look at him. He's shaking. He wanted to disappear. His entire body was screaming for an exit, to vanish behind the gate, to melt into the wall, to rewind the clock even just 5 minutes. But there was no going back. He looked up at the large screens above the stadium, where now the cameras showed Ibrahim Traoré not sitting in the golden chair, but humbly among the cleaning staff. The president had smiled. He had spoken about hunger, about cracked bottles and broken shoes. He had forgiven the world without saying a word. And here the guard was, frozen in humiliation, as strangers around him turned a simple mistake into a public joke. He lowered his head, his lips tightened. A wave of heat and shame washed over him. He didn't care about the cameras now. He didn't care that it was being filmed. He just wanted to say sorry. But how do you apologize to the president? How do you walk up to the man you just denied access in front of the whole country and tell him you were wrong? He didn't know. So instead, he stood still. He stood inside the echo of his own decision, drowning in the noise of other people's laughter. He didn't fight back. He didn't explain. He just let the moment consume him. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, You didn't mean to disrespect him. You were doing your job. He came in like any man would, but it didn't matter. Because the cameras didn't care about nuance. The crowd didn't care about intentions. The internet certainly wouldn't care either. And then, just as the laughter around him grew louder, something happened. A shift, not in the crowd, not in the cameras, but behind him. A familiar step, a presence that quieted the noise not with sound, but with stillness. Someone had returned, and the young guard, heart pounding, didn't dare turn around. Not yet, because he already knew who it was. The crowd hadn't seen him approach. He didn't come with a microphone or a spotlight. There were no drums, no grand entrance. Just the soft, even pace of a man who never needed noise to be heard. Ibrahim Traoré had come back. The young guard's back stiffened as he felt a presence behind him. Calm, composed, unmistakably powerful. He didn't need to turn around. His body already knew. His breath caught in his throat again, but this time not out of fear. Out of something deeper. Regret, humility, shame. Then he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. Firm, steady, not heavy, not accusatory, just grounding. Human. He turned slowly, afraid to meet the eyes of the man he had stopped just an hour ago. And when he did, he almost couldn't breathe. Traoré was looking at him not with anger, not with judgment, but with something the young guard never expected. Respect. For a moment, no words were spoken. The noise of the crowd faded. The laughter stopped. The phones trembled slightly in hands now held still. Then Traoré spoke, and though his voice was quiet, it carried like thunder. No one should blame you, he said gently. The guard opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His lips trembled. His eyes welled up. You did what was right, Traoré continued. You followed the rules. You stood your ground. Burkina Faso needs men like you. The guard's knees nearly buckled. He shook his head slowly, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't mean. But Traoré didn't let him finish. Without ceremony, without hesitation, he reached forward and pulled the young man into an embrace. A full embrace, genuine, in public, in front of cameras, in front of ministers, in front of the world. The arena held its breath. And then it broke, not in noise, but in emotion. The silence shattered into gasps, into tears, into a swelling wave of applause that rose from the back rows to the front. People stood without knowing why. Some cried without shame. A woman near the gate dropped her phone as both her hands flew to her face. On the live stream feed, comments flooded in from across the continent. This is what leadership looks like. He didn't just forgive him, he honored him. I've never cried watching a president hug someone. Even the guard couldn't hold back anymore. He collapsed into Traoré's shoulder, sobbing, not from guilt now, but from relief, from grace, from the overwhelming realization that his mistake hadn't ruined him. It had revealed something greater. The president held him steady, patting his back softly like a brother would. When they finally pulled apart, Traoré placed both hands on the young man's shoulders, looked him in the eye and said, "You're exactly the kind of man I want protecting this country." The crowd erupted. But it wasn't just applause. It was a collective exhale, a moment of release, a nation watching the impossible happen, a leader not rising above a mistake, but lifting the person who made it. No speech could have said more. No ceremony could have felt fuller. And in that instant, the golden chair on the stage lost a little more of its meaning. Because the real power had just happened, right there, in front of the gate where it all began. The clip didn't take long to reach the world. One moment, it was a shaky phone recording of a young security guard being embraced by the man he had just denied entry. The next, it was everywhere. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram Reels, WhatsApp statuses. Across Burkina Faso, then West Africa, then beyond. The hashtag humble president appeared within the hour. By sunset, it was trending in 5 countries. Captions flooded in beneath the videos. "This is how you lead." He didn't punish the guard. He empowered him. No gold chair, no crown, just heart. African youth influencers reposted it. Diaspora communities lit up with pride. Even Western news outlets began picking it up with headlines like, "Burkina Faso president turns mistake into moment of grace." No security, no badge, just humanity. Inside the stadium, people were still recovering from what they had just witnessed. Many were still on their feet, some still wiping tears, unsure of what to do with what they had just seen. Ministers exchanged stunned glances. Soldiers stood straighter. The air still vibrated with emotion. But amidst all the buzz, inside and online, Ibrahim Traoré was already walking away. Not out of avoidance, not for the cameras, but because his work was not done. He didn't stop for an interview, didn't wave to the crowd, didn't so much as glance at the media pit where journalists were now shouting questions, scrambling for quotes. He just walked, calm, purposeful, silent, down a narrow corridor that led backstage, past production equipment, power cords, and folding chairs. A place no one expected a president to go. A place where volunteers rested, where janitors waited for their cue to clean up, where things were forgotten, and yet that's exactly where he was headed. One aide tried to follow. He raised a finger gently. "No," he said, "not here. Let them finish out there. I have someone I need to see." No one knew exactly what he meant, but it was clear he wasn't finished writing the story. Because while the internet was breaking, something bigger, something quieter, more human, was about to happen. Not for likes, not for cameras, but for the heart of the nation. And as the crowd outside began to chant his name in rhythmic waves inside that darkened hallway, Traoré disappeared into the shadows. Not to hide, but to find someone else no one had been watching. The arena had begun to settle, slowly, cautiously. The applause had faded into murmurs, the crowd adjusting to the emotional gravity of what had just unfolded. Cameras panned across the audience, pausing on tear-streaked faces, clasped hands, eyes still wide with wonder. Some were already convinced they had just witnessed the moment of the day, but the most powerful moment was still waiting. It didn't come from the front row. It didn't come from the stage. It came from the second row, where a small elderly woman was slowly rising to her feet. She stood slowly, her hands trembling as they clutched a wooden cane. Her frame was bent with time, but her eyes, though rimmed with age, still held fire. She wore a faded headscarf and a modest dress, the kind worn by rural midwives and grandmothers who had known more hunger than comfort. At first, no one noticed her. Then a soft voice cut through the stillness. "Excuse me," she said, almost a whisper. "May I speak?" A few turned. A nearby usher hesitated, unsure. The microphone had been passed back to the event organizers. The program was already off script. There were no scheduled testimonials. But before anyone could respond, a figure from behind the stage, Traoré himself, emerged. He raised a hand. "Let her speak," he said. Silence returned like a curtain dropping. A handheld mic was passed to the woman. Her hands shook as she held it, but her voice, once it found strength, rang with clarity. "You don't know me," she began, staring straight at Traoré. A few camera operators leaned in instinctively. The crowd hushed once more. "But you saved my daughter," she said, "when I had nothing." The words dropped like stones into a still lake. Traoré's brow furrowed slightly, not with confusion, but with something else, a memory trying to surface. The woman took a deep breath. It was 5 years ago. Rebels had burned my clinic in the north. My husband was killed. My daughter's leg was torn by shrapnel. We ran into the night, into the bush, bleeding, barefoot. I thought we would die out there. Her voice cracked slightly. She steadied herself on her cane. And then a soldier appeared, dust-covered, rifle slung over his shoulder, wounded himself. But he didn't ask who we were. He didn't hesitate. He picked up my daughter and carried her. Traoré was no longer standing still. His head tilted, just slightly, and his lips parted. The memory was rising. The woman nodded, eyes glassy. "You carried her for 5 miles, she said, through darkness, through checkpoints, through a war zone. She screamed. You never let go." Gasps rippled through the audience again, not for drama, but disbelief. The story didn't sound real. It sounded like myth. Except the woman wasn't crying for effect. She was speaking like someone who had been waiting years just to say this out loud. "I never knew your name that night," she continued. "You never said it. You just handed her to another medic and disappeared back into the smoke." She turned now, fully toward him, her voice soft but unwavering. "I learned who you were years later, when I saw your face on TV. And today, when I saw you turn away from that golden chair and sit with the people, I knew. It was you." The stadium didn't move. Even the press pit was quiet now. Traoré's hand rose slowly to his mouth. He was remembering. The girl, the blood, the weight, the heat of that night, the smell of fire and gunpowder, the ache in his shoulders, the way the woman had collapsed to her knees, praying silently as he disappeared into the trees. He hadn't thought about it in years, and now she was here, alive, speaking. The weight of the silence pressed in again, not emptiness, but honor. A nation now watched not a president, not a soldier, but a man being remembered by someone he thought had long forgotten him. And the look in his eyes said it all. He didn't save her daughter to be thanked. He didn't carry that girl to be remembered. But in this moment, he was. The woman's voice had fallen silent, but her story still hung in the air, unshaken, unchallenged, as if time itself had paused to make room for memory. The arena was frozen in reverence. Some had their hands clasped, others covered their mouths. A few were already wiping their eyes, but she wasn't done. With one slow, deliberate motion, she reached down into the faded handbag hanging from her shoulder, a bag so worn the handles had been stitched back with string. Her fingers searched through it carefully, as though what she was about to retrieve wasn't just an object, but a piece of her life she had carried through fire and fear. She brought out a small plastic sleeve, yellowed at the edges from age and air. Inside was something wrapped in white cloth, though now it was no longer white. The fabric was stiff in places, soft in others, stained through with time. But most striking was the mark at its center, a deep brown-red blot, unmistakable in what it once was. Blood. The audience held its breath. She peeled back the plastic carefully, almost ritualistically, as though unveiling something sacred. Then she held the cloth high for all to see, hands trembling, but her gaze never wavering. "This," she said, her voice cracking now, This is what you wrapped around her foot." The words did not echo. They landed heavy and raw. "You tore it from your own uniform, I remember. You didn't speak. You didn't ask questions. You just knelt beside her, took off your jacket, and ripped the sleeve. You wrapped it so tight the bleeding stopped." Traoré did not move. He stood still, hands loosely at his sides, eyes fixed on the cloth like it was some kind of ghost, one he didn't know still existed. "I couldn't throw it away," she continued, now sobbing gently. "I didn't keep it because it was clean. I kept it because it saved her life." And then she took one slow step forward, and another, and another. The crowd parted silently as she approached the stage, each person instinctively lowering their phones, their cameras, their heads. She climbed the small steps with great effort, her cane knocking gently against the wood. A stagehand tried to help her, but she waved them off. This moment was hers. When she finally reached him, she extended the cloth with both hands. Traoré's lips parted, but no sound came. His body tensed, his chest rose, then fell, and for the first time that day, he broke. He knelt, not out of protocol, not out of weakness, but because something inside him had given way. His knees met the stage floor, his head bowed, his eyes filled, then spilled over. And still the cloth hung in the air between them, a symbol of pain, of memory, of grace. He reached out, gently, reverently, and took it. The moment their hands touched, the crowd dissolved into tears. Some cried softly, some audibly. Even those who had stood firm through his earlier speeches found themselves undone. Volunteers leaned against walls. Journalists lowered their lenses. Not one person looked away. Because this was no longer a political event. This was no longer about titles or office. It was about a boy who never forgot a wounded child, and a mother who never forgot the boy. Traoré held the cloth to his chest, still kneeling, and whispered something only the cameras could catch. "I remember that day. I just didn't know it mattered this much." She leaned down, not as a citizen to a president, not as a speaker to a leader, but as a mother to a son. She wrapped her arms around him, and he let her. And in that embrace, there were no speeches, no noise, only humanity. The cloth lay pressed against his chest, the color of old blood now etched deeper than ever into his memory. For a long moment, Traoré didn't rise. He knelt there, still, quiet, eyes closed. Not because he was overwhelmed, but because something inside him had been shifted, cracked open by a truth he never expected to face in front of thousands. And then, softly, almost like a confession, he whispered the words that would echo far beyond the arena. "I remember that day. I just didn't know it mattered this much." His voice was raw, unmasked, exposed. There was no microphone to carry it, but those close enough heard, and those far away felt it. It wasn't the words alone. It was the tremble in them. The way a soldier speaks when memory comes crashing in through the door he'd kept locked for years. He looked up, eyes glistening, and met the gaze of the woman before him. There were no more titles between them, no power gap, no ceremony. Just two people. One who had given help without asking, and one who had never forgotten receiving it. Traoré rose slowly, still holding the cloth, and then did something that silenced even the faintest murmur in the crowd. He embraced her. Not a polite hug, not a stage gesture. He leaned forward and wrapped both arms around her like a man greeting his own mother after a long, unforgiving war. And she, with a gentleness that came not from weakness but from survival, rested her chin on his shoulder and held him in return. That single embrace said more than any headline ever could. And in that moment, something changed in the room. Those who had laughed earlier, at the young guard, at the mix-up, at the idea of a president arriving on foot, now sat frozen, eyes burning, hands over mouths. Laughter had been replaced by something deeper, not shame, awakening. They weren't just watching a reunion, they were witnessing a reckoning with forgotten kindness. A repayment of debt no one had ever demanded, but the heart remembered anyway. In the front row, a woman who had once scoffed now bowed her head. A teenager who had filmed the gate incident earlier slowly lowered his phone, as if realizing some moments were too sacred to capture. Volunteers wept silently in the wings. A soldier clenched his jaw, eyes red. Even the most hardened among them felt it. This was leadership, not the kind that ruled from above, but the kind that knelt down, remembered, and embraced the forgotten. When they finally separated, Traoré didn't say another word. He simply nodded to her with both hands over his heart, then turned back to face the crowd. No one clapped. They just stood, a slow, rising wave of people, from children to ministers, rising not for performance, but for presence. And for the first time that day, everyone understood. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is remember. The arena was still humming with the quiet aftershock of tears when a small commotion rippled near the south exit. It began with the startled gasp of a vendor, rolled into a murmur among the ushers, and finally burst into the soft patter of hurried footsteps. From the tangle of legs and dresses and uniforms emerged a boy, no more than 8, his shorts slightly too big, shirt missing a button, and bare feet dusty from the long walk outside. Clutched tightly in both hands was a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded so many times the edges had begun to feather. He darted past volunteers who tried gently to guide him back, past ministers talking in hushed tones, and past a pair of cameramen who swung their lenses toward the sudden blur of movement. The boy did not slow until he reached the open space just below the stage where Ibrahim Traoré still stood, the bloody cloth now tucked safely inside his shirt pocket. Chest heaving but eyes bright, the child tipped his chin up and held out his treasure as if presenting a royal decree. The paper shook slightly, nerves perhaps, or simply his small arms struggling to contain an oversized emotion. A security officer moved instinctively to intercept, then hesitated, remembering the lesson of the earlier embrace. Traoré caught the motion out of the corner of his eye and raised a calming hand. The arena seemed to inhale as one, unsure what miracle might unfold next. The boy spoke, his voice thin but steady, carrying farther than anyone expected. "You're the reason I'm still in school," he said in French-tinged moire. The sentence, so simple, sliced through the remaining pockets of chatter like a clean bell note. He unfolded the paper with great care, revealing rows of subjects and marks: mathematics, science, history, a tidy line of grades that shimmered like metals under the stadium lights. An inked stamp in the corner confirmed first place in his class. But more than the numbers, it was the story scrawled at the bottom that mattered. A handwritten note from his teacher praising extraordinary perseverance despite hardship. Traoré stepped forward, descending the stage steps one deliberate stride at a time. He crouched to meet the boy eye to eye, his broad frame folding gently so the distance between president and child vanished. He did not reach for the report at once. Instead, he asked the boy's name. "Mahamadou," came the reply, pride and fear mingling in the syllables. Traoré repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory, then lifted the report card with both hands, holding it not like a scrap of paper but like something fragile, alive. His gaze lingered on the miniature triumphs printed in neat columns, then drifted to the teacher's note, and finally to the smudged fingerprints along the margin. Evidence of how tightly Mahamadou had been holding his future. Without a cue from any director, every screen in the arena cut to a close-up of that moment. The calloused fingers of a soldier president cradling the hope of a barefoot boy. Viewers on live streams around the world saw it too, their comment feeds erupting in 100 languages. Some typed praise, others prayers, but most simply posted a single emoji, 2 hands joined, because words felt too small. Traoré looked up, his voice a hush but amplified by microphones left hot by technicians who sensed history in the making. "Your report card is proof," he said, "that a nation rises on the shoulders of its children." Then he added, almost to himself, "And I must be worthy of that weight." He gathered the boy into his arms, lifting him with effortless care, as a father might after a long day. Mahamadou's head fit neatly beneath Traoré's chin, and the president's eyes closed for a heartbeat as if anchoring himself to the innocence he held. Around them, the crowd did not cheer. They surrendered to a stunned quiet, a silence saturated with pride. The hush broke only when Mahamadou's teacher, standing several rows back, began to sob openly, her hands over her mouth. That sound, raw, unguarded, spread tears like contagion. Even the press gallery, trained to keep distance, lowered their cameras in collective reverence. When Traoré finally set the boy down, he pressed the folded paper back into the small hands that had carried it so far. "Guard this," he whispered, "as proof to anyone who doubts what you can do." Then he slipped a simple bronze pen from his pocket, the same one he had used to sign emergency food aid orders months earlier, and offered it to Mohamedou. "And write your next chapter with this," he said. The boy nodded, eyes glistening, and stepped back, clutching both pen and paper like twin promises. As he disappeared into the sea of legs, the arena felt subtly rearranged, as though every adult had grown an inch taller, not in stature, but in resolve. A single child had reminded a country why it fights corruption, why it rebuilds burned schools, why it teaches multiplication tables by candlelight when the power fails. And the man who hugged him had reminded the world that leadership is not measured by the thrones we sit on or the crowns we wear, but by the futures we choose to lift. The sun had not yet risen when the first footsteps touched the road. There was no drumbeat, no loudspeaker, no camera drone buzzing overhead, just a soft breeze cutting through the early morning stillness, carrying the scent of dust and warm bread from roadside vendors, preparing for a day unlike any other. In the heart of Ouagadougou, street by street they came, from neighborhoods both wealthy and worn, from alleyways and hilltops, thousands began to walk. Some came barefoot, some in uniforms, some with babies on their backs and tools still hanging from their belts. There were no signs, no slogans, no chants, just silence, deep, moving, intentional silence. At the center of it all, walking without entourage or shield, was President Ibrahim Traoré. He wore no suit, no sash, just the same dust-stained white shirt he'd arrived in the day before. His footsteps were light, unhurried, as though he was not leading the people, but walking with them. Around him, old men raised their hands to their hearts. Young women held candles. Children gripped notebooks and scraps of fabric that reminded them of yesterday's miracle. They moved past shuttered shops and open markets, past schools still bearing bullet holes from old rebellions, past clinics with cracked walls but brave nurses inside. Every street they touched seemed to pause and listen, as if the city itself knew something sacred was passing through. There was no predetermined route, no security perimeter. People simply joined in wherever they could. The line of marchers soon stretched for miles, snaking through the city like a river of breath. Journalists tried to cover it, but most lowered their microphones before long. Words felt too loud, too crude for a moment so precise. Traoré stopped often, not to wave, but to listen. At one corner, he bent to greet a street cleaner with a limp. At another, he paused to take the hand of an elderly man who hadn't spoken since losing his son in the last conflict. Neither said a word. They just stood, hand in hand, heads bowed. Some held flowers, others carried nothing at all, save for memory. From rooftops, children tossed down small paper hearts. From windows, women wept quietly. The silence was not emptiness. It was acknowledgement, an offering of space, of presence, an entire nation exhaling, together. As they passed the cemetery wall on the outskirts of the capital, Traoré slowed. The same graveyard he had visited alone the morning before now stood witness to thousands. Many didn't know why he paused there, but they followed suit, and slowly, like the folding of prayer, every hand lifted to every heart. No horns, no applause, just that shared electric stillness. Someone later said that in that moment, even the birds stopped to listen. By the time they reached the riverbanks, the sun had broken fully over the horizon, casting long shadows behind every marcher, as if to remind them they no longer walked alone. No speeches were made that day, no ceremony was planned, but those who were there would remember it forever as the march that made no noise. And in homes across the country, when parents explained it to their children, they did not speak of politics or protests. They simply said, "We walked with a man who remembered us, and we walked in silence so the world could finally hear." By the time the march reached the edge of the city's oldest square, something extraordinary had already taken shape. A movement without a leader, a silence louder than any speech. The crowd had swelled into the tens of thousands, but not a single order had been given. No chants had been rehearsed. No security lines held them in. And still they moved with harmony, like a people who knew instinctively how to walk together when they were finally seen. Ibrahim Traoré did not walk at the front. He had no staff ahead of him, no guards to clear a path, no media crew to frame his every step. He chose instead to walk within the crowd, not leading it, not following it, but becoming part of it. A hand on a shoulder here, a nod to a grandmother there. He met every glance, no matter how fleeting, with the same quiet attention. No one shouted his name. No one waved signs. They just walked, with him, around him, as him. Children who might have run ahead instead slowed to match his pace. Old men reached out to touch his sleeve, not to seek favor, but to confirm that he was real. And Traoré, without microphone, without podium, spoke in the only way that truly mattered. Not with volume, but with presence. "You don't need to raise your voice to be heard," he said softly to a street vendor walking beside him. The vendor nodded, eyes welling. "You just need someone who's finally listening." There were no declarations, no slogans to shout. Instead, people began to tell him things, small things, heavy things. A young teacher spoke of chalk bought from her own salary. A father confessed to skipping meals to buy books. A nurse whispered how she sterilized equipment with boiled rainwater. And to each story, Traoré didn't respond with speeches. He responded with silence, with a hand, with a pause. He didn't fill the air with answers. He filled the moment with acknowledgement. And so, what began as a president walking through his city became something entirely different. A people learning that they could walk without being told how, that they didn't need to wait for permission to matter. One young man, barefoot and shy, stepped close enough to murmur, "Are you not supposed to lead us?" Traoré looked at him and smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing gently. "No," he said, "let the people lead. I will follow." The phrase passed from mouth to mouth like a spark in dry grass. By dusk, it was written in chalk on school walls, whispered in open-air buses, scrawled on receipts and notepads across the country. And long after the march ended, that one line remained: "Let the people lead. I will follow." A sentence not shouted from power, but carried in the steps of every person who, for the first time, believed their path mattered. The final day of the national event arrived with all the signs of grandeur. The stage was freshly decorated, flags lined the open sky above the arena, and the media, local and global, had gathered in full force. Cameramen prepped their lenses, news anchors rehearsed their intros, and everyone anticipated one final, powerful speech from the man who had stirred a nation without a single boast. Ibrahim Traoré was expected to walk up to the podium as the headline act, to close the ceremony with wisdom, strength, and presidential gravity. The chair embroidered in gold thread still waited for him under a solitary spotlight. Microphones hummed. The band readied its final notes. The crowd leaned forward in silent anticipation. But then he did what no one expected. As the host stepped up to formally invite him to the stage, Traoré raised his hand calmly, interrupting without speaking. He stood, but not to claim the podium. Instead, he looked across the faces before him, scanning the rows of people, not the dignitaries in the front, but those seated at the edges, the faces time and power often forget. And then, in a voice that needed no amplifier, he said, "This stage was never meant to be mine alone. Today, it belongs to the people." The arena fell into a hush. He gestured gently to the side, and from the wings, 5 people began to emerge. Hesitant, wide-eyed, unsure if they had heard right. The first was a widow, clothed in dark cotton, her back curved by grief and years of silent labor. Her husband, a soldier, had died in a raid the previous year, leaving her with 4 children and no pension. She walked slowly, her feet unsure on the wooden steps, until Traoré himself took her hand and helped her up. Next came a teacher, thin and tall, her fingers stained with chalk. Her school had no desks. Her students brought their own stools. Yet every one of her graduates had passed national exams. Then a disabled girl, no older than 12, moved forward in a wheelchair pushed by her mother. Her name was Marama, the same girl whose letter had once gone unanswered. Today she would not be ignored. From another corner came a street boy, shirt torn, holding a cap in his hands. Just days earlier, he had been begging outside a bakery. Now he stood trembling at the edge of the stage, unsure of how to speak but unwilling to back away. And finally, from the farming districts in the north, a weathered man in boots appeared. He looked out of place in the marble grandeur of the arena. But when he stepped onto the stage, every hand in the crowd recognized the sunburn on his face as the mark of a man who worked the land, not for profit, but for survival. Traoré helped each of them onto the stage. He did not speak. He stepped aside. And one by one, these 5 souls, unpolished, unrehearsed, unapologetically human, shared their truths. The widow spoke of loss, the teacher of faith, the girl of hope, the street boy of hunger, and the farmer of dignity. There were no applause lines, no political messages, just raw testimony. And the crowd, which had come expecting a final presidential declaration, instead stood frozen by something far more powerful. A platform finally given to the unheard. And as each one spoke, the camera didn't pan back to the president, because he was no longer the center of the story. He was standing quietly at the edge of the stage, watching, listening, and smiling. Just as he had always promised to do. The final speaker had just stepped down, and the crowd, now suspended in a quiet awe, believed the moment had passed. 5 ordinary lives had just reshaped the meaning of leadership. People clapped, not out of ritual, but with hearts stirred by truth. The master of ceremonies stepped forward again, ready to close the event. But before he could speak, a soft, uncertain voice rose from the far right of the arena. "Excuse me." All eyes turned. It was a young girl, no older than 9. She stood barefoot on the aisle steps, holding something close to her chest. Her clothes were clean but faded, her braids tied in mismatched string. She held herself upright, but her lips trembled. At first, no one moved. A guard instinctively stepped forward, unsure if she was lost. But Traoré raised his hand again, his signal now universally understood, and walked slowly to meet her. The girl clutched a folded photo, worn and soft at the edges, its creases a map of time. She looked up at him, and in a voice barely louder than a breath, she said, "My father never came back." The arena froze. She unfolded the picture. The image was old, the ink faded by sun and memory. 2 soldiers stood in the frame. One was Ibrahim Traoré, young, eyes sharper, jaw set like stone. The other was a taller man, arm wrapped around him in camaraderie. "This was taken during a mission in the north," she whispered. "My papa said you saved him once." The sentence hung like smoke in the air. Then came the second blow. "But he didn't make it the second time." The weight of her words cracked the stillness. Even the birds above the open dome seemed to stop mid-flight. Traoré did not speak. His gaze locked on the photo. Recognition flooded his face. Not confusion, not surprise. Memory. He swallowed hard and then, with slow fingers, reached into the inner pocket of his shirt. From it, he pulled out a small object. A worn prayer bead. Brown. Frayed. Carried through deserts, through ambushes, through victories and losses. "I've kept this," he said quietly, "since the day he died in my arms." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The girl looked at the beads, eyes wide, and nodded. "He used to wrap it around his wrist when he prayed," she said. Traoré knelt, not to lower himself, but to meet her fully. He placed the prayer bead gently into her hands, and as he did, she collapsed into his arms, not with drama, but with the rawness of a child who has finally touched proof that her father mattered. The cameras flashed but were quickly lowered. This was not a moment for the news. It was a sacred reunion between memory and legacy, and behind them, thousands of eyes blurred with tears. Traoré held her, his eyes damp, and whispered words meant only for her. No microphone captured them. No journalist repeated them. But the silence in the arena said everything. Because in that space of stillness, between one girl's grief and a nation's mourning, the crowd remembered. Real leaders don't build monuments. They carry memory, and sometimes they return it to the ones who need it most. The girl still knelt before him, the beads clutched tightly in her small hands, as if afraid that if she let go, the memory would vanish too. Ibrahim Traoré remained crouched beside her, his arm gently resting around her back, steadying her, holding her, not as a man of state, but as a man who understood what it meant to lose someone too soon. No one dared interrupt. The arena, which had moments ago echoed with shared grief and recognition, was now a cathedral of silence. Not even the wind moved. Even the flags, so full of motion at the start of the day, hung still as if bowing to the weight of this sacred moment. Then slowly the little girl raised the prayer beads to her chest. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She pressed the beads, her father's beads, into the space just above her heart, curled into herself, and began to sob. They weren't theatrical cries. There was no screaming, just the quiet, uneven breaths of a child who finally had something to hold on to. A connection, a confirmation, a goodbye that had been waiting too many years. And at that, the arena rose, not to cheer, not to clap, but simply to cry with her. From the front rows to the very last tier of seats, people stood as one. Hands covered mouths, eyes reddened, shoulders trembled. Some reached out to the person beside them. Others dropped their heads in prayer. Ministers stood, soldiers stood, vendors, mothers, dignitaries, foreign journalists. All of them stood not in protocol but in reverence. Even the cameras stayed still, pointed downward, because the world didn't need a quote from this moment. It needed to feel it. Ibrahim Traoré didn't rise right away. He stayed kneeling beside the girl, his own head bowed, his eyes glistening. And when he finally stood, he didn't turn to face the cameras or the crowd. He turned to the girl and placed a hand gently on her head. Not a blessing, just acknowledgement. And then he stepped back. There was no music, no anthem, no closing speech. He had said enough. And what had been said today, by a child, a cloth, a photo, a necklace, would echo longer than any speech ever could. The girl was led gently back to her seat, the beads still in her hand. She looked at no one, but her steps were steady now, as though some burden had lifted, as though a father had finally returned, not in body but in remembrance. One of the event organizers, voice trembling, leaned toward the microphone and asked, "Mr. President, do you wish to address the nation now?" Traoré shook his head, then quietly replied, "They've already heard everything they need. Not from me, from us." And with that, the lights dimmed, not in performance, but in peace. Before dawn, with no press and no convoy, Ibrahim Traoré slips through the city's sleeping streets toward an abandoned cemetery on the outskirts. A low fog clings to the cracked headstones. Only the rustle of dry grass answers his footsteps. He finds a simple, unpainted marker, the grave of Adama Coulibaly, the comrade who once dragged him from gunfire and paid with his life. Traoré kneels, lays a single white hibiscus, and whispers so softly the wind must bend to hear, "I do all of this for you." For a long minute he stays, head bowed, until a hint of sunrise brushes the sky and reminds him promises are kept by the living. Walking back through a sandy alley, he's spotted by a handful of school children already playing before class. They hesitate, then run closer, astonished to see the president alone. Traoré squats, draws a small rectangle in the dust, and asks, "Which colors belong here?" Eager hands shape red, green, and gold stripes with bits of chalk and bottle caps. Soon the ground is a mosaic of flags. Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, even imaginations of a united Africa. A passerby snaps a photograph, the nation's leader barefoot in the sand, laughing with kids over a shared dream. By noon, the image floods West African feeds, hailed as proof that greatness wears no crown. Later that afternoon, the closing ceremony reconvenes. Traoré steps on stage, the hall hushed from days of astonishment. He says only 9 words. "This country has enough of my voice. Listen to yours." Then he leaves. No selfies, no handshakes, no lingering for applause. Outside a side gate, a small boy watches him quietly set his shoulder to an old woman's wheelbarrow, guiding it over the ruts. The boy's quick photo captures dust, effort, and an unguarded smile. By evening, it circles the continent under one caption: "Leadership is not a crown. It is the cloth you use to wipe your people's tears." And across the region, from villages to capitals, people point to the screen, nod, and say with quiet pride, "That's my president." What moves me most in Traore's story is its deliberate smallness. In a world addicted to spectacle, he chooses sandals over sirens, silence over slogans, a dusty side gate over a gilded throne. That restraint is not modesty for its own sake. It is strategy. By stepping down, he lifts others up, transforming a security guard's embarrassment into honor, a widow's pain into national memory, a child's report card into a symbol of collective possibility. His actions also expose a quiet indictment. Many of us wait for the right position before doing the right thing. Traoré flips the equation. He reminds us that titles do not enable kindness. Kindness justifies titles. The uniform sleeve he tore to save a bleeding girl carries more moral weight than any medal pinned to it later. Objectively, the narrative is almost cinematic, and cynics might call it staged. Yet even if someone tried to choreograph humility, the tears of an entire arena cannot be faked. Mass emotion, at scale, is earned only when a leader's private choices match his public claims. That alignment lights a path for the rest of us. No matter how small our circle of influence, authenticity multiplies impact. The story is ultimately hopeful. It tells us that dignity doesn't trickle down from marble halls. It rises from market stalls, school desks, and unmarked graves. A cloth, a bead, a photograph, mundane objects become national talismans when touched by compassion. If one man can spark that alchemy in a fragile nation, imagine what 1,000 ordinary acts could do in our own neighborhoods. Your turn. When was the last time you exchanged convenience for compassion? And what would happen if, just once this week, you stepped aside so someone else could stand in the spotlight? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.